Welcome to Count Me In. I'm Adam Larson, and on today's episode, I'm joined by fraud and crime expert Rich Brody. We'll break down what white collar crime really means, how it's evolved, and why it's often misunderstood by public and the media. Rich also reveals how these nonviolent financial crimes sometimes escalate into violence, introducing us to the concept of red collar crime, and discuss the challenges facing law enforcement. Plus, we'll explore how technology keeps changing the landscape and what we can do to protect ourselves and our organizations. So get ready for practical advice, real stories, and eye-opening insights into the world of fraud and financial crime. Well, Rich, thank you so much for being on Count Me In. And we're going to be sitting here talking about fraud and different types of white collar, red collar types of crime. And I wanted to start off with maybe we can start off with the definition of white collar crime, because I'm sure people hear it all the time. They've heard it in news forecasts. They've heard it in, TV movies that they've seen about it. But maybe you can start off by defining it.
Yeah, and there's multiple ways to define it, and some people get into more technical definitions. What I like to say is when we talk about white collar crime, is it's some type of fraud committed by someone that doesn't involve violence. And we could get into more detailed definitions, but that's what I generally think of, that most people are thinking white collar crimes are typically financial type crimes. Now we have all kinds of cyber crime and things like that would also fit. But generally speaking, it would be these types of crimes that don't involve any type of violence.
And the white collar comes from because of corporations and people always used to wear white shirts, right? Is that white collar part comes from?
Well, the definition goes back to Edwin Sutherland way back when. And when he came up with the definition for white collar crime, and he's the one that defined it, he basically used the idea that it was people of high social status. So that's where
Okay.
part of it came from. And he was really kind of the first one to talk about these crimes not just being committed by low-level criminals. The high social status of people in their occupation. And over the years, that definition has developed and been modernized, I guess would be the word, because as we know, white collar crime isn't just committed by corporate executives, and it's not just committed in the course of your business. So we have lots of street criminals committing white collar crime, and it doesn't have to be related to the job. When we think of embezzlement and things like that, sure, that does. But what about people with Ponzi schemes and things like that? So the definition has definitely evolved over the years.
Do you think with the rise of movies like Wolf of Wall Street, among a bunch of other movies and a lot of the media, do you think it's kind of romanticized these types of crimes?
Well, to a certain extent, it has. I mean, people, Wolf of Wall Street's a good example. People watch the movie and they think it's a great movie, and they don't really focus on all the victims. And
Yeah.
when I was teaching my fraud class, I used to say that you don't want to always think about things in ways that aren't common. But I would say something like, a brain surgeon, you know, if they screw up, their victim, it's one victim, and it's terrible that that person may have died or become incapacitated. But when you think about the Madoff scandal and other big financial scandals, Enron, thousands and thousands of people were victimized. So, to kind of put it in perspective, even if there isn't violence involved, the number of victims can be really excessive, and the dollar amounts involved can also be just extraordinary when we put the whole picture together.
And it seems like a lot of times the focus becomes on the person who did the crime as opposed to the people who it affected.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I've written about, is that there are third party victims often in these cases, and it's very, very difficult to focus on them at times. It may not be as exciting, but just the Madoff scandal alone, so many victims and so many people's lives were affected by that. And it is important to remember that it's not just the perpetrator of the fraud who's impacted by the crime he or she has committed.
Yeah, I think that's what struck me when I read your article and you talked about that because it was one of those things where I think I've gotten caught up when I think about the different frauds. You get caught up in the maybe the romanticization of it, especially when you watch the movies, you see the documentaries. You focus so much on the person who did it, and you forget that there's a lot of other collateral damage almost.
Absolutely, and the problem is, and I think this is generally a societal problem, is when we talk about white collar crime, people don't realize the reach that it can have and the impact on their life. So I always come up with this idea that if if the sheriff showed up at your door and said, "Hi, we're hiring new people in your area. Where would you like us to put our new deputies?" And, how far down on the list would you have to go until white collar crime was ever mentioned? It probably wouldn't be mentioned. And that's not to downplay the importance of, you know, drugs and gangs and crimes against children and things like that. But in a lot of cases, they're related to white collar crime, and people just don't look at it that way. They view it as a victimless crime that doesn't impact them, but that would change dramatically if you talk to someone who actually was a victim.
Yeah, I think it also probably plays into the fact of, because they look that person who committed the crime just looks like my neighbor down the street. He would never do anything. And then I think that plays into that thought of like what a criminal supposedly looks like.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. And it's very, very relevant because we talk about the challenges in prosecuting a white collar criminal. And one of the challenges is that if there's a jury, the jury's looking at this person thinking, that person looks just like me or just like my neighbor, and there's no way they did this horrific crime that's being discussed. So, on top of all of the other challenges associated with prosecuting a white collar criminal, that's one that really stands out when you start thinking about juries and how they respond to these types of issues.
And also something I've noticed too is that there's never a perfect they always want the perfect victim. The jury will be like, well, that victim I didn't believe this part of their testimony. Like the victim has to fit a perfect profile in their head. And I think that's part of the problem too.
Absolutely. And the other problem is, we call it the CSI effect. People want, forensic evidence. And
Yeah.
what people don't realize is lots and lots of trials and convictions are are not based on forensic evidence. And juries have just come to expect this from TV. It's hard enough to prove a white collar case, in a murder, you've got a victim, you've got a body, you've got all
Yeah.
kinds of evidence. A lot of these white collar cases, sometimes it's circumstantial evidence, which again is perfectly good evidence for a jury to consider to convict someone, but it's a paper trail, and sometimes the connections aren't quite as strong. It might be, one of the reasons we don't see a lot of prosecutions of these cases. um, the individuals involved typically get, good high priced attorneys, and the other side is probably, a DA's office or something like that, and they don't have the resources, and they typically don't have the training. Um, you could even extend that to law enforcement. A lot of law enforcement officers are not given training in white collar crime. So when they're doing their interviews, especially their initial interviews, they may not be asking the right questions or getting the evidence that they need that could be available, that they're just not thinking that way.
So in that same chain, at what point do the law enforcement bring in the fraud examiners and the auditors to kind of look at these things? Do they come in a lot later, and so do things get missed that way?
Well, I think it probably depends on the jurisdiction. Where did the crime take place? How much money is
Yeah.
involved? You're not going to call the FBI over a $500 fraud. People do show up at the FBI office on a regular basis. Here's this email I got, and I gave my bank account information, and all my money's gone. So you need to get my money back for me. And we know that's just not going to happen. But law enforcement in general, in my experience working with a DA's office, Maybe they have an economic crimes person, maybe, but they're focusing on the higher profile cases, maybe
Yeah.
the cases that are going to get media attention. But I really feel like it's more a function of it's a losing battle for them. They don't have the expertise. It's hard to convince a jury. So most cases really don't go to trial. Most are settled,
Hmm.
at least in my experience, except for the really, really big cases that make the news. Um, those may get settled as well, but it's just an issue of having the expertise and the training and the resources available. And this gets back to the whole idea of where do you want the police department and sheriff's departments to spend their resources? And again, I don't know how far down you'd have to go until white collar crime ever came up.
Yeah. That's an interesting thought because, what if we taught the police officers about the white collar crime things, because I feel like those are more widespread. You have it goes back to what you can see and what you can't see. The white collar crime sometimes it's the like quote unquote victimless crime, like you said, and that's a huge problem because those people are probably more affected for a longer period of time as opposed to other smaller things.
I mean, it can be done, and I won't name the jurisdiction where I was working. Some people will be able to figure it out. But I
Yeah.
actually, when I started working with the police department, they had a white collar crime detective, and he pretty much on his own developed a manual to train police officers, and it was broken down almost into a checklist that if you show up on a call and it's a financial crime, here are the questions that you ask. Just follow this manual. And we actually created an internship program where I would send some of my grad students to work with law enforcement. And the students were not law enforcement professionals, but the law enforcement professionals were not fraud experts. So it was a really good marriage. It worked really well. But unfortunately, what it comes down to is the DA's office had to be willing to prosecute these cases. And I don't think it's just particular to the one that I was dealing with, that they really didn't want to do that. But between the students and the detective working on the case, a very strong case could be put together before it even goes to the district attorney. But the law enforcement agencies have to be willing to make that commitment. And I get where they're coming from. If they only have so many resources, they're going to focus on the violence and the drugs and things like that, not the white collar. So I think
Hmm.
that's another big part of the problem is the resources just are not available, or they're not being chosen given the scarce resources that are available.
That makes sense. Now, when you first defined white collar crime, you said, some sort of crime, that it's nonviolent. But can what happens when it becomes violent? Because there's been some very, very high level cases that have been in the news. They made a Netflix documentary about the most recent one, and so maybe we can talk a little about when does it turn violent? And how often does that happen?
So we've got all these different colors now associated with crime, and
Okay.
some are better than others. Some maybe more a little bit of a marketing effort, but we have red collar crime, and red collar crime is basically white collar criminals who engage in violent acts to quiet someone who has the ability to expose their fraud. And in many, many of these cases, we're talking about murder. Uh, and so you're probably referencing the Murdoch case, which is a super high profile case of, and people want to know, why would this guy kill his wife and one of his sons? Well, we know he was committing a very large levels of fraud. So there was a concern, I guess, that his family could expose him. His case was a little odd because I think part of it was also he wanted to get the attention off of him. So murdering his wife and son was an attempt, I think, to redirect people to something else, maybe also get more sympathy for himself. But there are many cases, we don't read a lot about red collar because the term isn't used by many people because they're not aware of it. I present all over, and I presented to Homeland Security, the NSA, the FBI, the Secret Service. I mean, I've worked with a lot of these organizations. And when you ask a room of people, how many of you are familiar with red collar crime, it's usually zero. And so not understanding what it is a big part of the problem because it's way more common than people think. I try to document some of these cases on my LinkedIn page so that people can see it. And the Murdoch case was a biggie, but again, if you read all those articles about the Murdoch case, I don't think you'll see one um, that uses the term red collar crime.
So it's interesting because as you were talking about that, it made me think about, again, I go back to movies where some person is trying to find out about some corporation and they find out and then suddenly that person ends up dead. And then goes to make you think, I'm like, that would be technically kind of like a red collar crime. And that happens again, another thing glorified in movies, like, well, I'm going to take care of the problem. My fixer is here. And, those fixers, like, how is that something that is actually happening all the time in corporations? Like, is it happening more than we realize?
Yeah, and then it's not limited to corporations by any means, and it has been around a long time. Now I'm kind of drawing a blank. Maybe I haven't had enough coffee this morning, but there was a very famous case in New York City many, many years ago that they made a movie and a book, and it was a red collar crime. It was a jeweler who was stealing from his business, and his bookkeeper had figured it out. So he hired hitmen and they attempted to, I think it was called the CBS murders, actually. And very high profile. The hitman apparently wasn't super competent. So spraying bullets in a parking structure in Manhattan. But that goes, way back. And so I think it's just a matter of people weren't aware of it. And now we can look at lots of cases and define them as red collar crimes or potential red collar crimes. It's just like when law enforcement shows up on a scene, sometimes they make snap judgments. And I'm certainly not being critical of law enforcement, but just because it looks like a suicide doesn't mean it's a suicide.
Yeah.
Kind of extended the red collar definition to include suicide. So instead of committing a violent act against another person, maybe you commit that violent act against yourself. And there are several high profile cases that were called suicides that, I mean, I'm not a forensic investigator with medical background, but some of these cases, potentially there was more evidence available, and these judgments can be made. Oh, this is a suicide, without really thinking about all the other implications surrounding the situation. You don't have all the evidence, and you're not just looking for blood and fingerprints. Maybe you should be looking for financial documents or bank statements or things like that. Um, the challenge in red collar crime, though, is that the victim is often not even related to the red collar crime. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I steal from my employer and it starts to eat me up inside, and I feel like I need to tell somebody. And I choose you. I'm going to tell you what I did. Adam, I stole from my employer. I feel terrible about it. I'm never going to do anything like this again. And oh gosh, I feel better letting you know. Well, now a couple months down the road, my thought process is a little bit different. I've become less rational. And I think I told Adam I stole from my employer. He's going to turn me in and my life's going to be ruined. I need to
Mm.
fix this situation. And my, decision is I'm going to take him out. Then he can't turn me in. So, very narrow minded, short term decision here. But that's what a lot of these red collar crimes are. So imagine you're an investigator and let's say I throw your body in the woods. The police show up, they find your body in the woods. Where's the connection between you and me? And remember
Yeah.
that the fraud took place months ago. So it's a very difficult area. And again, sometimes the linkages aren't there or they're not obvious. And without thinking about other potential explanations. In many of these cases, they're kind of open and shut just because on the surface they look like what they're saying happened.
And then they can never connect it back to the fraud that happened. That is why they did it.
Right. Now we do have some cases where they can bring
Yeah.
it back. The Murdoch case is one of those examples. There are others, and there are also others that involve accounting people. And my co-author and I wrote a paper about a woman named Sally Rohrbach. And Sally was an insurance auditor in the state of North Carolina. Most of us would say, not the most, dynamic job ever, but someone has to do it. And Sally was interviewing an owner of an insurance agency where it was pretty apparent that he was embezzling. So he was collecting premiums from his clients and not applying them to the policies. And Sally was asking him these questions, and sadly, he murdered her. And when they
Wow.
found her body and they traced it back to him, that's backwards. They talked to him because they knew she was there and that he
Gotcha.
led them to her body. But when they asked him why he did it, he said she was asking too many questions. So the relevance of this red collar idea is very significant. Anybody who is working in a field that involves fraud, whether it be law enforcement, an accountant, a forensic examiner, um, these people may get information that someone doesn't want them to have. And in those situations, people can do very irrational things, murder being the worst of them here. But again, there are lots of examples of this happening. It's not just with accounting people, we're finding it with caregivers, which is really scary. Uh, lots of people, they've got aging parents, they don't always live near them. They hire a caregiver to assist. The caregiver realizes how easy it is to steal from that person. Um, and again, eventually, what can happen is this irrational thought of, oh my gosh, this elderly person is going to tell his or her family or turn me in and my life's going to be over. So they commit murder. And I've written a bunch of articles that document cases and provide details if anybody's really interested in the specifics. There's a lot out there that documents these cases over time, and it's very scary. It's very scary to think that a caregiver, can't be trusted. And it's not just the financial aspect of it, but sometimes it's too late. You figure out there's financial stuff going on, but the bad deeds have already been done. So,
Hmm.
awareness and education are a good starting point for this. I try to give these elder fraud presentations, and they can't really be given to the elderly people. They need to be given to their kids. They need to be
Yeah.
given to people who are watching them. It's very sad. You become very cynical about people when you spend so much time dealing with fraudsters, whether they're violent or non-violent.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Like, if you're in this and researching these things and either like writing about them or actually you're examining those frauds and prosecuting them, how does one stay balanced when like how do you trust anybody when you know that these things can happen? Like how do you manage that?
I mean, the honest answer for me is I don't trust anybody. It's the safer way to go. I mean, I try to teach my son not to trust people. He's a very kind, caring, trusting individual. But that's who these criminals look for. They look for people like that. Basically, when you take on forensic engagements, you try really hard to separate yourself from the people
Yeah.
involved. I had a pretty good consulting practice, which really helped in the classroom because I was able to talk about cases and civil cases and criminal cases and things like that. But ultimately, you try to be objective. It's not easy to be objective, and you try to separate your emotions from the case, and you try to remember that you're not hired to win or lose. I mean, you're hired to provide. In most cases, you're hired by the attorney, and you're providing guidance and you're putting materials together for them. Ultimately, the jury and the judge decide guilt or innocence. And, I've had cases where I technically lost and I took it personally. And, when you find out, well, why did you lose? I mean, it's typically not something that I've done. It's the way it played out in court.
Yeah. And I just realized, like, we can't really have this conversation about fraud and the different types of crime. How has technology played a role in as technology has advanced? Like, how has that affected like how these people are able to get around laws and do their crimes?
Well, probably one of the biggest is just, the growth of cybercrime.
Yeah.
We kind of do know where these people are. I mean, they're typically not in the United States. They could be in Eastern Europe. They could be in Nigeria. It's a thriving industry for people because there's really no cost involved. So when we think about the growth of cybercrime, I always think about like a room with like a boiler room with people sitting at their desks with computers, and they're just sending out tons of emails, and they don't need a lot of hits to make money. Certainly their profit percentage is extremely high, but again, I think a lot of it comes down to education. Those
Hmm.
phishing emails that we all get, they still work with people. It's still a big industry. In fact, some of the research that I've done has shown that they don't often use proper English, proper grammar, and we know that. And for a lot of us, we say, "Oh, this is so silly. I mean, this is can't be a real person if it's got all these errors in it." But they almost do that on purpose because they want to limit the size of the fish that they get, the pool. Uh,
Yeah.
if everything was perfect, they'd have more victims, and they're already getting enough victims. So the types of crimes have expanded dramatically from what we're used to. It's a big industry for these fraudsters. And again, if the likelihood of going to prison is so low, and there's no barriers to entry, it's why we see it happening. I used to tell my class, actually, I didn't tell them this the first time, but I learned to tell them, we're going to talk about frauds, and we're not talking about them so you can go out and do them. We're talking about them so you can understand them. But the reason I
Hmm.
had to tell the class that is because I gave a lecture one time. This is several years ago, maybe earlier in my fraud career, talking about here's a really easy way for all of us to become rich without doing very much. And I went through a process of what we could do. And the next class period, a guy came in and he was getting ready to do it. And I said, "Are you crazy? You can't do that." He said, "Well, I was gonna tell them afterwards that it was just for a class." So then I had to tell people not to do it, but it really is pretty easy. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gullible people out there. We
Yeah.
see all these romance frauds that have become even more popular. And the criminals are smart. They know who to target. People post so much stuff on social media that it makes it easy as a criminal to figure out what to say. Now we have all the deep fake stuff, and
Hmm.
we don't know, is this a legitimate video or not a legitimate video. We have the grandparent scam where the grandparent doesn't think about calling people before sending money to his or her poor grandchild who's in a prison in another country. So the criminals have kind of figured it out, and as we move ahead with things, they figure out more. Um, we've got all kinds of issues with cryptocurrency, so that's another new area for fraud. Probably not even that new anymore, but the criminals seem to be one step ahead of everybody else.
Yeah. So, I think this has been a great conversation, kind of covering all these elements. And so if somebody's listening to this and say, what are some things that we can do, personally or within our organizations to kind of help avoid these frauds?
Well, prevention is the cheapest way to go. I always say in my speeches that if you don't, everybody has fraud. Every organization has fraud. Some are lower level fraud, some higher level fraud. But I'll ask the audience, how many of you think your organization doesn't have fraud? And typically a few hands will go up. And I'll say, well, your organization probably has double or triple the fraud of anybody else's organization if you don't think you have fraud. So, you know, having somebody come in and do a fraud speech, which, I do regularly for a lot of organizations, there's no charge involved. It's a community service for me. There are lots of professional speakers out there who come and speak about fraud, and these organizations are probably thinking, oh, I'm not going to pay their speaker's fee. That's insane. But if you think about the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report to the nations, they consistently come out with their fraud estimate as being 5% of revenue. And you could go to any organization, profit, nonprofit, governmental, you're probably not going to have to spend anywhere near 5% of your revenue to have a fraud expert come in. So again, to me, it's all about education, um, whether it's corporate, whether it's personal. It's important to understand these things and to spend the time to learn about them. And again, using cost as an excuse is just not a good decision. It's not just the money that organizations lose. It's reputational effects and things like that, time and effort involved in prosecuting. There's so much more involved that it doesn't make sense not to learn more about it. And, that could be having people in your organization go to training or having, my argument is most fraud is going to be uncovered by a tip, not by your auditor, not by your internal auditor. And the best way to get tips is to educate the employees about what they need to be looking for. Um, we sometimes forget that a lot of workers don't have the same background that we have and the same education that we have, and they might not know anything about fraud. So if you don't teach them about it and
Mhm.
tell them what to do and give them a way to we could spend the next hour talking about hotlines and how to properly have a hotline. But ultimately, people need to know what to look for and what to do if they see something.
Definitely. Well, Rich, I want to thank you so much for coming on Count Me In. We're definitely going to have you back because there's so much more to talk about. But this has been a great conversation, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.